The night was loud with music and laughter, and the grand hall of the millionaire's mansion sparkled with golden lights. Every guest carried a glass of champagne in their hand, and the air was filled with the smell of expensive perfume and the sound of shallow conversations. In the center of it all stood Adrian, a young millionaire known not only for his wealth but also for his arrogance. He was tall, handsome, and dressed in a black suit that glittered with diamonds on the cuff. People admired him, feared him, and envied him all at once, because Adrian had everything a man could want. Yet he always wanted more. As the night grew late, his group of close friends gathered around him, their voices dropping into teasing tones. They had been drinking heavily, and the conversation turned into cruel games. One of them smirked and said, "Adrian, you can have any woman you want. But what about the ones no man desires?" The others laughed, clinking their glasses together. Their laughter had a sharp edge, meant to push him into proving himself once again. Adrian raised an eyebrow, amused and unbothered. "Name your challenge," he said with a sly smile, leaning back in his chair like a king waiting for entertainment. His friends exchanged looks, and then one leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "There's a woman in town. She's large, she's quiet, and everyone ignores her. Marry her, Adrian, and show us you can turn even that into a victory." The crowd around them burst into more laughter, the kind that stung even when it was not directed at you. But Adrian's pride was a dangerous thing, and he never walked away from a dare. His ego demanded that he accept, not because he wanted the woman, but because he wanted to prove he was untouchable. He lifted his glass and declared, "Fine, I'll do it, I'll marry her, and I'll show you all that no one, no matter who, can stand in my way." The announcement spread through the party like fire, and whispers filled the hall. Some guests were shocked, some entertained, but most were eager to see how far Adrian would go. It was just another cruel story for them, a game to watch and gossip about, but for Adrian it was pride, and pride was a poison he could never resist. The woman they spoke of was named Clara. She lived a quiet life, working at a small library and keeping to herself. She was large, yes, but her presence was soft and warm, like a blanket on a cold night. Most people never noticed her except to whisper cruel jokes, but Clara carried herself with quiet dignity, never letting the weight of their words bend her spirit. When Adrian approached Clara the next week, he expected hesitation, fear, maybe even desperation. Instead, she looked at him with calm, steady eyes. "Why me?" she asked simply, her voice even. Without anger or hope, Adrian, not used to being questioned so directly, smirked and said, "Because I chose you. And isn't that reason enough?" But Clara's eyes did not drop, and her silence unsettled him in a way he could not explain. The proposal was quick, the arrangements even quicker. The city buzzed with gossip, mocking Adrian for his strange choice. Some said he had gone mad. Others believed it was just another one of his games. Clara, however, did not explain herself, nor did she complain. She walked into the marriage with a quiet strength that confused Adrian. He had thought she would be weak, desperate, and easy to control. Instead, she seemed unbothered, as if she had already accepted a truth he had yet to see. On the day of their wedding, the grand hall was once again filled with people. This time the whispers were louder, the laughter sharper. The guests dressed in their finest clothes, not to celebrate, but to watch what they thought was a spectacle. Adrian wore his pride like armor, walking down the aisle with Clara at his side. Clara, in a simple white dress, looked neither ashamed nor proud. She simply walked with her head held high. As the vows were spoken, Adrian noticed something strange. Clara's hands did not shake, her eyes did not lower. She stood with a quiet grace that made him feel, for the first time in years, unsure of himself. The laughter of his friends echoed in the hall, but their voices began to sound far away. For a brief moment, Adrian wondered if he had underestimated her, but the thought vanished as quickly as it came. Swallowed by his pride, he reminded himself it was only a bet, nothing more, yet deep inside a seed had been planted, and though Adrian did not know it, that seed would grow into something far beyond what he had bargained for. After the wedding, the city refused to stop talking. Every cafe, every office, and every corner of the market hummed with the same whispers. People laughed at Adrian behind his back, saying the great millionaire had finally lost his mind. Others sneered at Clara, claiming she had trapped him out of greed. But Clara never reacted. She walked through the streets with her head held high, ignoring the cruel words that floated around her. Adrian expected her to crumble under the weight of judgment. He thought she would shrink, hide, or cry, begging him for comfort. Instead, she carried herself with the same calm dignity she had on the day he proposed. Her quietness was not weakness, it was strength, and that strength unsettled Adrian more than open defiance ever could. On their first morning together, Adrian woke up expecting chaos. He imagined Clara fussing around the mansion, nervous, clumsy, and desperate to please. But when he entered the dining room, he found her calmly reading a book with a cup of tea. The servants moved around her, taking quiet instructions. The table was set, breakfast prepared, and everything seemed in perfect order. Adrian frowned, confused. "You didn't wait for me?" he asked, half expecting an apology. Clara simply closed her book and replied, "I didn't think you needed me to." Her answer was simple, but it struck him. He was used to people bending over backwards for him, hanging on his every word, yet Clara treated him with neither awe nor fear. She treated him like an ordinary man. It was insulting and refreshing at the same time, and he could not decide which feeling bothered him more. Days turned into weeks, and Adrian watched Clara carefully. She did not demand gifts or beg for his attention. She spent her mornings tending to the library she refused to abandon. In the evenings, she cooked alongside the chefs, not because she had to, but because she enjoyed it. Sometimes, she sat in the garden with her notebook, writing things she never shared with him. She was present in his house, yet she never clung to him, never sought his approval. Adrian began to feel like he was the one chasing after her presence, not the other way around. One evening, during a grand dinner, Adrian's friends came to visit. They expected entertainment, hoping to mock Clara in front of him. As the men laughed and drank, one of them whispered loudly, "Adrian, how does it feel?" "Living with your little project," another added. "Careful. She might eat all your fortune before you notice." Their cruel words filled the room with harsh laughter, but Clara did not flinch. She simply looked at them with calm, steady eyes and replied, "A man who spends his fortune on empty bottles and broken promises should worry more about himself than about me." The room went silent. The laughter cut short. Adrian's friends shifted uncomfortably, embarrassed at being outwitted so easily. Adrian, for the first time, felt a strange surge of pride. He had expected Clara to bow her head in shame, but instead, she had defended herself with intelligence and dignity. That night, when the guests left, Adrian could not shake the memory of her words. They replayed in his head stronger than the laughter of his friends. Yet pride kept him from admitting it. He told himself it was nothing. Just luck, just sharp timing, but deep inside, he knew Clara was not what he thought she would be. She was not a burden, not a trophy, and certainly not a fool. She was something he had never expected, a woman who saw through the shallow games of society. As weeks turned into months, Adrian began noticing the little things. The way Clara remembered the names of every servant and treated them with respect. The way she calmed the house staff when they panicked over his temper. The way she never raised her voice yet always managed to be heard. Adrian, who once thought power came only from money and control, began to see a different kind of strength in her. A strength that needed no wealth, no fame, only quiet confidence. Still, his pride battled with his growing respect. He had married her as a bet, and to admit otherwise would mean admitting he was wrong. His friends continued to mock him, reminding him of the original deal. But each time they laughed, Adrian's discomfort grew, because their words no longer matched the reality he was living in. One late night, Adrian found Clara in the study. Surrounded by papers, she was reviewing documents with a sharp eye, notes neatly written in the margins. "What are you doing?" he asked. Surprised, Clara looked up calmly. "Your business contracts. Half of them are riddled with traps you haven't noticed." Adrian blinked, stunned. "And you know this how?" She smiled faintly. "Because I read carefully, unlike your friends who only read numbers." For the first time, Adrian felt something he had not expected to feel: dependence. He realized Clara was not just his wife by a bet. She was becoming someone he needed. The thought unsettled him, yet it also gave him a strange sense of security. He went to bed that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, asking himself why the woman he once saw as a joke now filled his mind with respect. Clara, meanwhile, never pushed him, never demanded recognition. She simply lived her life with quiet grace, leaving Adrian to wrestle with his own pride. But the walls he had built around himself had begun to crack, and whether he admitted it or not, his unexpected bride was changing him. one day at a time. The first few months of marriage passed quietly, but life inside Adrian's mansion was far different from what people imagined. From the outside, everyone thought Clara was just a shadow in his grand world, a woman placed in his home because of arrogance and pride. But behind the tall iron gates and golden chandeliers, something unexpected was unfolding. Clara was not invisible. She was present in every corner of the house, not loudly but in ways that made her impossible to ignore. Adrian had always ruled his mansion with impatience and command. The staff feared his anger, rushing to obey his words before he even finished them. But Clara brought a calmness the house had never known. She listened to the maids, learned their names, and remembered the smallest details about their families. When a young maid cried because her father was ill, Clara quietly arranged for a doctor, paying the fee without a second thought. For the first time, the servants looked at their mistress not as a burden, but as someone they could respect. Adrian noticed it slowly, though he pretended not to. One evening he returned home after a frustrating meeting, his temper sharp, his voice rising at the staff. But Clara stepped forward, her presence quiet yet firm. "That's enough," she said, not with anger but with steady authority. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, and the room fell silent. The staff relaxed, their eyes turning to her as if she were the true master of the house. Adrian wanted to be angry, but he found himself stunned. Unable to speak that night as he sat alone, he realized his wife had done what he never could: earn loyalty without fear. Clara's influence extended beyond the mansion walls. She continued working at the library, refusing to give up her independence. She spent her afternoons surrounded by books, helping children with reading and guiding students through their studies. People who once mocked her now saw her as a woman of substance, though they never admitted it aloud. And when Clara walked back into the mansion each evening, her calm energy seemed to bring light into Adrian's cold halls. Adrian, meanwhile, began to feel something strange. He started noticing her absence. On days when she stayed longer at the library, the mansion felt emptier, meals felt incomplete, the rooms colder, and even the sound of his own footsteps echoed differently. He told himself it was nothing, just habit, just routine. But deep inside, he knew it was more. The woman he had once thought of as a joke was slowly becoming the center of his world. Though he refused to admit it, behind closed doors, their conversations began to change. At first they were short and formal, polite exchanges with little meaning, but slowly, Adrian found himself asking her opinion on small things. What color should the new drapes be? How should the garden be arranged? Clara answered simply, never pushing, never forcing. Yet each time she spoke, her words carried sense, balance, and thought. Soon Adrian found himself discussing his business with her, half as a joke, half as curiosity. To his shock, she understood more than he expected, pointing out risks he had ignored. "You think money solves everything," she said once, her tone calm but firm. "But money without wisdom only builds a cage." Adrian could not forget those words. They echoed in his mind when he sat in meetings, when he faced his so-called friends, even when he stared at the city from his office window. Clara had given him a truth he had never dared to face. And though he hated to admit it, she was right. The world outside still mocked their marriage. At parties, whispers followed them, cruel laughter hiding behind polite smiles. Adrian's friends continued their taunts, asking him when he would end the game. But something had shifted inside him. The words that once made him laugh now made him uncomfortable, because when they mocked Clara, it no longer sounded like a joke. It sounded like an insult to someone who deserved far better. One evening, Clara entered Adrian's study to find him staring at old photographs. He looked up, his expression strangely weary. "Do you ever wonder what people really think of us?" he asked. His voice quieter than usual. Clara walked over, placing her hand gently on the desk. "What people think has never built a home." "Adrian," she replied, "but what we do inside these walls, that builds everything." Her words were simple, yet they struck deeper than any criticism he had ever heard. For the first time, Adrian wondered if true power was not in wealth, but in the respect a person commanded without demanding it. Behind closed doors, Clara was not the image people painted of her. She was not the weak woman they laughed at, nor the burden they assumed she would be. She was strength wrapped in softness, intelligence hidden beneath silence, and dignity unshaken by cruelty. Adrian, the man who had married her for a reckless bet, was beginning to see it, even if he could not admit it aloud. The world outside might never know the truth of their marriage. But within the walls of the mansion, a quiet transformation had begun. Adrian's arrogance was being tested, his pride was being chipped away, and the man who once thought of Clara as a bet was slowly discovering that behind closed doors, she was not the one who should be underestimated. The seasons began to change, and with them, the rhythm of life inside the mansion shifted. Adrian, once restless and impatient, found himself pausing more often, watching Clara without meaning to. She had become the quiet center of his world. Though he had not yet admitted it, her calm presence was like gravity, pulling everything into balance, holding steady what once felt unstable. It was during this time that Adrian began to face new challenges in his business. A string of deals that once seemed certain started to show cracks. Trusted partners delayed payments, contracts revealed hidden traps, and whispers of betrayal circled like vultures. Adrian, proud and stubborn, wanted to fight alone. But Clara saw through him. She noticed the late nights, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he snapped at the staff without cause. One evening, she walked into his study and placed a stack of papers in front of him. "These are the contracts you signed this year," she said softly. "I've read them all and I think you should look again." Adrian frowned, ready to dismiss her. But something in her voice made him pause. He flipped through the documents and was stunned to see her notes in the margins. Each mark was sharp, each comment clear, pointing out weaknesses and traps that even his lawyers had overlooked. "How did you see this?" he asked, his pride softening into curiosity. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I've read all my life, Adrian. I may not have your fortune, but I understand people. And contracts are written by people." Her words struck him deeper than she knew. Adrian realized that while he had been busy playing the role of a king, Clara had quietly been sharpening her wisdom. He sat back in his chair, staring at her with a new kind of respect. That night, for the first time, he admitted to himself that Clara was not just strong, she was essential. In the days that followed, Clara's strength revealed itself in ways Adrian could no longer ignore. When his so-called friends came to visit, eager to drink and laugh at his expense, Clara did not hide in the background. She sat with them, listened carefully, and with a few well-placed words exposed their lies. One man boasted of a deal he claimed would make millions, but Clara calmly pointed out a detail that revealed it was nothing more than a scam. The room went silent and the man left in embarrassment. Adrian's friends began to realize that mocking Clara was dangerous, because her intelligence could cut sharper than their cruelty. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself relying on her more. He asked her opinion before meetings, listened to her quiet suggestions, and found that her instincts were rarely wrong. But what amazed him most was her ability to see through people. She could tell when someone was lying, when someone was afraid, when someone was hiding greed behind polite smiles. Adrian had always trusted numbers, but Clara trusted her heart and her eyes. And more often than not, she was right. Her hidden strength was not only in her intelligence, but in her compassion. When one of the staff fell sick, Adrian planned to replace him without thought. But Clara insisted on visiting the man's home, bringing medicine and food for his family. She returned and told Adrian firmly, "Loyalty is not bought with wages. It is earned with kindness." Adrian had no answer, because deep down he knew she was right. One night, as rain fell heavily outside, Adrian confessed something he had never admitted to anyone. "I thought this marriage would be my victory," he said quietly, his voice heavy with shame. "But it feels more like you have won instead." Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "This was never a game for me, Adrian," she replied softly. "I walked into this marriage knowing the world would laugh. But I did not marry you to win or lose. I married you because I saw a man who could be more than his pride." Her words left him shaken. For years, Adrian had been surrounded by people who praised him for his wealth. But here was a woman who saw him for what he truly was, and for what he could become. He lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, wondering why he felt both humbled and grateful at the same time. As weeks passed, Clara's strength became the shield that protected Adrian from destruction. One of his closest advisors tried to trick him into signing away control of a company. Adrian, blinded by loyalty, nearly agreed, but Clara intervened. She laid out the advisor's lies with calm precision. Saving Adrian from disaster, the man was removed, and Adrian's empire remained intact. For the first time, Adrian realized that without Clara, Everything he had built might have already crumbled. Behind her quiet smile was a woman of steel. She had been underestimated her whole life, mocked, judged, dismissed because of her appearance, but Adrian was now beginning to see what the world refused to. Her strength was not loud or cruel, it was steady, unbreakable and wise. It was the kind of strength that turned storms into lessons and enemies into shadows. Adrian, the man who once married her as a reckless bet, now found himself leaning on her more than anyone else. And though his pride still whispered that he should resist, his heart was beginning to whisper something far stronger, that maybe, just maybe, Clara was not only the strongest person he had ever known, but also the one he could no longer imagine living without. The rumors about Adrian's marriage never truly stopped, even as months turned into a year. People in the city continued to laugh and whisper whenever they saw him with Clara. For society, their union was still a spectacle. A strange story told at parties and gossiped about in drawing rooms. But inside the mansion, the truth was very different. Adrian had begun to depend on Clara in ways he had never depended on anyone before. And that quiet reliance made him uneasy. His old friends noticed the change and were quick to mock him. They teased him when they met, their voices sharp and cutting. "Have you fallen in love with your little project?"
"Adrian," one of them sneered, "don't forget."
It was all just a bet. The laughter that followed used to amuse him, but now it felt heavy. As if it carried chains, Adrian forced a smile, pretending their words didn't bother him. But deep inside, his pride and his heart were at war. One evening, his closest friend, Marcus, arrived unannounced. Marcus had been with Adrian through many reckless adventures, and he was the loudest voice that had cheered when the marriage began. Now Marcus leaned close and whispered, "It's been long enough. Adrian, end it, prove your point, claim the victory, and walk away." Adrian's hand tightened around his glass, his jaw stiff, but before he could answer, Clara entered the room carrying a tray of tea, her calm presence filling the space like a quiet storm. Marcus smirked at her, his words sharp. "Enjoying your life as a millionaire's wife? Are you?" Clara placed the tray down without flinching, meeting his gaze directly. "Enjoying your life as his shadow? Are you?" she replied. The room fell silent. Marcus shifted uncomfortably and Adrian felt something stir in his chest. Pride. But not for himself, for her. After Marcus left, Adrian sat in his study, unable to think. His friends wanted him to choose them, to stay loyal to the bet, to the arrogance that had once ruled him. But Clara was no longer just a bet. She had become the woman who steadied his world. His loyalty was being tested, and for the first time, Adrian wasn't sure which side he truly belonged to. Days later, the test became sharper. At a grand gathering filled with business leaders and politicians, Clara accompanied Adrian, dressed in a simple gown that carried elegance without effort. The whispers began the moment they walked in. Why is he still with her? He could have had anyone. This must be some cruel game. Adrian heard every word, each one cutting deeper than the last. But Clara walked beside him without lowering her head, her hand resting calmly on his arm. Her dignity burned brighter than the chandeliers above, and for once, Adrian realized the mockery was not aimed at her. It was aimed at him, because only a weak man would marry for a bet and stay for pride. But a strong man would recognize the treasure standing quietly beside him. The night turned worse when one of the men, drunk with arrogance, spoke loudly. "Adrian, tell us, how long will you keep this charade?" Laughter rippled across the hall, and all eyes turned to see his reaction. For a moment, Adrian's pride screamed at him to laugh along, to shrug and treat Clara as nothing. But then he looked at her, standing with quiet grace, her eyes steady, her strength unshaken. Something inside him broke free. He stood tall and said, "This is no charade. Clara is my wife, and she deserves more respect than any of you in this room." The hall fell silent, shocked by his words, and for the first time, Adrian had chosen her openly, not as a bet, not as a joke, but as his partner. When they returned home that night, Clara said nothing at first. She removed her jewelry, placed her gown carefully away, and finally looked at him. "You didn't have to defend me," she said softly. "I can carry their laughter." Adrian stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I wasn't defending you, Clara. I was defending myself, because a man who lets others mock the woman who saved his life is no man at all." Clara's eyes softened. Though she remained quiet, her silence heavier than any words. In the days that followed, Adrian's friends grew distant. Some avoided him, others mocked him more fiercely, accusing him of being blinded by a woman he once swore was nothing. But Adrian no longer cared. Their voices had lost power, replaced by Clara's steady wisdom each time he doubted. Her presence reminded him of the truth, that loyalty was not to his pride or his friends, but to the woman who had stood by him when no one else did. The true test of his loyalty came when Marcus returned with an offer. He handed Adrian a contract, a deal that would make them both richer than ever. But the final clause was cruel. It required Adrian to declare his marriage a sham, to walk away and sign papers that would annul everything. Marcus leaned in, his smile sharp. "This is your chance, Adrian. Take it, end this game, and prove to the world you're still the man you used to be." Adrian stared at the papers, his pride battling with his heart. The deal promised wealth, power, and the approval of his old circle. But when he thought of Clara, of the way she had saved him, protected him, and stood firm in the face of cruelty, he realized something. If he signed the papers, he would not only lose her, he would lose himself. He pushed the contract back toward Marcus and said, "The man I used to be is gone, and I don't want him back." Marcus left in anger. But Adrian felt strangely free for the first time. He had chosen Clara over pride, over money, and over false friends. That night when he returned home, Clara looked at him with quiet curiosity. He did not tell her the details, but he whispered, "I chose you." And though she said nothing, her eyes glistened with a light that told him she understood. The test of loyalty was over, and Adrian had finally passed. What began as a reckless bet was slowly becoming a bond built not on arrogance but on choice, and with every step, Adrian realized more and more that his loyalty no longer belonged to his pride. It belonged to the woman who had shown him what true strength looked like. The mansion grew quieter after Adrian cut ties with his old circle. The men who once filled his halls with laughter and cruelty no longer visited. At first the silence felt strange, almost heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath, but slowly, Adrian realized the absence of their voices was not a loss but a relief. For the first time, his home felt like a place of peace rather than a stage for pride. Adrian's business, however, was entering a storm. One of his largest companies faced a scandal, a deal gone wrong that threatened to ruin his reputation. Investors pulled away, newspapers wrote cruel headlines, and whispers of failure spread through the city. The man once known for arrogance now stood on the edge of collapse. He spent long nights in his study, surrounded by papers, his pride cracking under the weight of fear. Clara watched quietly, never pressing, never demanding, but one night, when Adrian sat with his head in his hands, she entered the room with a folder. "I've been looking through your records," she said softly, "and I think there's a way to fix this." Adrian looked up, exhaustion heavy in his eyes. "And what would you know of this mess?" he asked. His voice sharp, though it carried no true anger. Clara placed the folder on the desk. Opening it to reveal her notes, she pointed to the contracts, the names, the overlooked details, and with calm precision laid out a plan. Adrian blinked, stunned, as he realized her words made sense. More sense than anything his advisors had told him. Together they worked through the night. Clara's mind was sharp, her ability to see through lies remarkable. She found loopholes, exposed false claims, and drafted responses that could protect Adrian's empire. By dawn, Adrian looked at her not with doubt, but with awe. "You've saved me," he whispered, the words strange on his tongue. Clara shook her head gently. "No, Adrian. I reminded you that you are more than your pride." The following week, Adrian entered the business world not alone. But with Clara's strategy guiding him, he confronted his rivals with evidence, exposing their corruption and turning the scandal back onto them. The same newspapers that mocked him were now forced to print headlines of his victory. Investors returned, confidence restored, and Adrian's reputation not only survived but grew stronger. When he returned home, the staff celebrated quietly, but Adrian's eyes searched only for Clara. He found her in the library, reading as if nothing had happened. Without thinking, he sat beside her and said, "Everything I am today I owe to you." Clara looked up, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "No, Adrian. You owe it to yourself. You listened, and that was the difference." But Adrian shook his head, his pride finally softening into something new. "No, I owe it to you because without you, I would have been blind." For the first time, the arrogance in his voice was gone, replaced with gratitude. That moment marked the turning point. Adrian no longer saw Clara as the woman he married for a bet. He saw her as his partner, his shield, his guiding star. And though he had not yet spoken the word aloud, love had quietly entered his heart. But with love came guilt. Late at night, Adrian lay awake. Haunted by the memory of his bet, he remembered the cruel laughter of his friends, the arrogance in his voice when he declared he would marry her. He remembered the whispers at their wedding, and the way Clara had walked with quiet dignity while he had worn pride like armor. The shame burned deeper with each passing day. How could he tell her the truth? That their marriage had begun not with respect, but with cruelty. One evening, Adrian sat at his desk, staring at the flames in the fireplace. Clara entered quietly, placing a cup of tea beside him. He looked at her, words trembling on his lips. But they refused to leave. Instead, he asked, "Clara, why did you marry me?" Clara tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. "Because I saw a man who was lost, and I believed he could be found." Her words pierced his chest, for she had given him grace he did not deserve. In the days that followed, Adrian's behavior changed. He no longer sought the approval of others, no longer chased pride as his crown. He began spending more time with Clara, listening to her stories, her dreams, and her quiet laughter. He joined her at the library, shocking the townspeople when they saw the arrogant millionaire helping children carry books. Rumors spread again, but this time Adrian didn't care. For the first time, the whispers of society held no power over him. The turning point was not only in his business but in his heart. The man who once saw marriage as a game now saw it as his salvation. The woman he once underestimated had become his greatest strength. And though guilt still shadowed his heart, he knew one truth clearly: he would never let her go. As the days passed, Adrian realized something even more surprising. It was not Clara who had changed the most, it was him. He had entered the marriage with arrogance and pride, but he was emerging with humility and gratitude. Clara had not only saved his empire, she had saved the man within it. And though he could not yet bring himself to confess the cruel truth of how it all began, he promised himself one thing: from this day forward, he would spend the rest of his life proving to her that she was never a bet. She was the best decision he had ever made. The shift in Adrian's heart was not sudden. It was slow and quiet, like dawn breaking after a long night. He began noticing Clara in ways he never had before. The way she tilted her head slightly when she was lost in thought. The way her laughter was soft yet warm enough to fill a whole room. The way her presence made the mansion feel like a home instead of a cold palace. He once thought strength meant power, money, and control. But now he saw strength in the way Clara carried herself with dignity, even when the world mocked her. He saw it in her patience when others lost their tempers. He saw it in her silence that carried more weight than the loudest voices. And for the first time in his life, Adrian felt humbled. One evening, they sat in the garden under the glow of lanterns. Clara was reading, and Adrian found himself simply watching her. After a long silence, he asked, "Do you regret it?" Clara looked up, surprised. "Regret what?" she asked. "Marrying me," Adrian whispered, his voice softer than it had ever been. Clara studied him for a moment, then closed her book. "No, Adrian, I do not regret it, because regret is for those who expect perfection. And I never expected perfection from you." Her answer struck him deeper than he could admit. In that moment, he realized she had accepted him even when he gave her nothing but arrogance. Adrian's guilt grew heavier, yet alongside it grew something stronger: love. He found excuses to spend more time with her. He walked with her in the garden, joined her at the library, even listened when she shared her thoughts about books he had never cared for. Each time she spoke, he felt himself drawn closer. Not by her words alone, but by the calm wisdom behind them. Clara never demanded his affection, never asked for his attention, yet Adrian gave it freely, as if his heart had chosen before his mind could catch up. The staff noticed the change before Adrian himself did. They whispered about the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. They noticed how he no longer shouted as often, how he seemed lighter when she was near. And though they dared not speak it aloud, they all saw that the arrogant millionaire was slowly becoming a different man. Still, the shadows of the past lingered. The bet was a secret Adrian carried like a wound. Every time Clara looked at him with trust, the memory of that cruel night returned. The laughter of his friends echoed in his ears, mocking him for the man he had been. He wanted to confess, but fear held him back. Fear that Clara would walk away. Fear that her quiet strength would finally break under the weight of betrayal. One night, as they sat by the fire, Adrian found the courage to ask Clara, "Do you believe people can change?" She turned to him, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "Yes, Adrian, but only if they want to, only if they are willing to face themselves." Her words felt like a mirror, showing him the truth he had been avoiding. He wanted to change, and more than that, he wanted to be worthy of her. So Adrian began to show his love, not with grand gestures but with small actions. He remembered her favorite flowers and filled the garden with them. He joined her in the kitchen, surprising the staff when he rolled up his sleeves to cook beside her. He stood by her side in public, no longer caring about whispers or mocking laughter. For the first time, his loyalty was not forced by pride but chosen by love. Clara noticed the changes, though she never pointed them out. She saw the way his eyes softened when they met hers. She saw the way his temper cooled faster, the way he listened instead of dismissing. And though she said little, a quiet warmth grew between them, a bond unspoken but deeply felt. The world outside still judged, but Adrian no longer cared. When whispers reached his ears, he simply smiled and said, "She is my wife," with a pride that came from love, not arrogance. And slowly the laughter of society began to fade, replaced by confusion and eventually by respect. Because while the world had expected the marriage to collapse, it was instead becoming stronger with every passing day. The true moment of realization came during a storm. The mansion lost power and the staff scrambled in panic. But Clara moved calmly through the halls, lighting candles, guiding everyone with quiet assurance. Adrian watched her, the flickering glow reflecting in her eyes, and something inside him shifted completely. He no longer saw the woman chosen for a cruel bet. He saw the woman he loved, the woman he needed, the woman who had given him strength when he had none. Later that night, as the rain poured outside, Adrian whispered to himself, "It's no longer a bet, it never was, not truly. It's love." The words were quiet, spoken only to the shadows, but they carried a truth that filled his chest. The man who once thought marriage was a game had finally learned its true meaning. And though he still carried the weight of his secret, he knew his heart belonged fully to Clara. From bet to love, the journey was complete in his soul, even if the confession had yet to be spoken. Years passed, and the story that once made people laugh began to change. What had started as gossip became a tale whispered with curiosity, then with respect. The world that mocked Adrian for marrying Clara slowly realized the marriage had not broken, but blossomed. The millionaire who once thrived on arrogance was no longer the same man, and the woman who was mocked for her weight was no longer seen as a joke, but as the pillar of his world. Adrian's empire grew stronger, not because of his pride, but because of Clara's wisdom. Together, they rebuilt companies, rescued failing projects, and created opportunities for people who had once been ignored. Clara insisted on funding libraries, schools, and hospitals, reminding Adrian that wealth meant nothing unless it served others. At first, society scoffed at these ideas, but as the years passed, those very acts of kindness became the foundation of Adrian's legacy. People who once mocked Clara now spoke her name with admiration. Though few dared to admit how wrong they had been, inside their mansion, life was no longer filled with shallow parties or reckless bets. It was filled with laughter, books, warm meals, and quiet evenings in the garden. Adrian found peace in places he had never noticed before. The sound of Clara humming as she cooked, the sight of her guiding children in the library, the comfort of her presence beside him during long nights. The man who once thought happiness came from wealth discovered it had been sitting quietly beside him all along. But the shadow of the past still weighed on him. The secret of the bet clung to Adrian like a chain he could not break. Each time Clara smiled at him with trust, he felt the guilt burn deeper. He had built a life with her, yet he had never confessed the cruel reason it began. The time had come to tell her, no matter the risk. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in gold and crimson, Adrian asked Clara to sit with him in the garden. His hands trembled slightly as he poured tea, his voice unsteady as he began. "Clara, there's something I must tell you, something I should have told you years ago." Clara looked at him calmly, waiting, her silence both comforting and terrifying. Adrian took a deep breath, his pride stripped away, his heart bare. "When I married you, it was not out of love, it was a bet. A foolish game I played to feed my arrogance," he confessed. His words hung heavy in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Clara did not speak immediately. She looked at the sky, At the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze, Adrian's heart pounded, each second feeling like a punishment. Finally, Clara turned her gaze back to him. Her voice steady but soft. "I knew," she said. And Adrian's breath caught. "You knew," he repeated. His voice barely a whisper. Clara nodded. "I may not have known the details, but I knew you did not marry me out of love. I saw it in your eyes, in your friends' laughter. But I chose to walk into this marriage anyway." Adrian stared at her, stunned. Why would you do that?" he asked. His voice breaking, Clara's eyes softened. "Because I believed people can change. I believed you could change." And I was right. Tears pricked Adrian's eyes. Not from weakness, but from the weight of her grace. He had carried guilt for years. Yet she had carried forgiveness all along at that moment. He realized Clara's love was not built on perfection, but on patience and faith. From that day forward, Adrian lived differently, not as a man trying to prove himself, but as a man grateful for the second chance Clara had given him. He cherished her openly, unashamed to show his affection, unafraid of whispers or laughter. At social gatherings, he introduced her proudly as his wife, his partner. His strength and society, once cruel, began to see what he saw. The quiet power of a woman who had turned arrogance into humility, pride into gratitude, and a bet into love. Years later, when Adrian stood on a stage to announce a new foundation built in Clara's name, the audience erupted in applause. The same city that once mocked now honored her. Reporters wrote not of her weight but of her wisdom, not of her appearance, but of her impact, and Adrian, standing beside her, whispered for only her to hear, "The best decision of my life was the one I never deserved." The surprising ending was not in wealth, nor in power, but in love. What began as cruelty had transformed into devotion. What began as a reckless bet had become a lifelong bond. And the world, once blind to Clara's worth, finally opened its eyes. But Adrian knew the truth more deeply than anyone. He had not saved her. She had saved him, and for the rest of his days, he would live with one unshakable truth, that the woman he once underestimated had been his greatest fortune all along. Time passed gently, and the story of Adrian and Clara grew into something larger than themselves. What began as whispers of scandal became a tale retold in the city, passed from one generation to the next. Children in schools read about Clara's libraries. Families spoke of her kindness, and young couples pointed to their marriage as proof that love was stronger than pride. The world had once laughed, but now it listened, and in that listening, respect bloomed. Adrian grew older, his hair touched with silver, his eyes softer than they had ever been. The arrogance that once defined him had long melted away, replaced with humility and quiet gratitude. Each morning he still rose early, walking the garden with Clara at his side. They spoke less of business and more of life, of memories, of the little things that had shaped their years together. Clara, her hair streaked with gray, still carried herself with the same calm dignity, her presence as steady as ever. Their home became a sanctuary not just for them, but for many others. The library Clara once guarded as her treasure had expanded into a chain of learning centers, each one bearing her influence. Children who had nothing found shelter in those halls, their laughter echoing against shelves filled with books Adrian often visited. Sitting quietly in the corner as Clara guided the students, he found joy not in wealth, but in the simple sight of young faces lighting up with knowledge. One evening, their staff gathered in the dining hall to celebrate Clara's birthday. The room was filled with warmth, laughter, and the sound of voices singing softly. Adrian stood to give a toast, his hands trembling slightly with age, but his voice clear with conviction. "I once thought wealth was the measure of a man," he began, "but I learned too late that true wealth is found in the people who stand beside you." He turned to Clara, his eyes glistening. "And you, Clara, have been my greatest fortune, my truest treasure." The hall erupted in applause, but Clara simply smiled, her eyes shining with quiet love. In the years that followed, Adrian grew weaker, his health declining slowly. Yet Clara remained his strength, never leaving his side. She read to him when his eyes grew tired, held his hand when pain made him restless, and whispered comfort when fear touched his heart. He would often say, "Clara, I don't fear the end, because you've already given me a life worth living." Her answer was always the same, "And I don't fear it either, Adrian, because love does not end. It continues." When the day finally came, Adrian passed away peacefully in his sleep, Clara holding his hand, her presence steady even as tears streamed down her face. The city mourned him, but more than that, it honored her. Because everyone knew the truth, that behind the man's legacy stood the woman who had shaped him, guided him, and transformed him. Clara did not seek grand titles or praise, but the people gave it to her anyway. They called her the heart of the city, a name that carried more power than any crown. In the quiet years that followed, Clara dedicated herself fully to her libraries and schools. She wore no jewels, no grand gowns, but wherever she went, people rose in respect. Children would run to her, calling her grandmother, even if she was no blood relative. Families spoke her name with gratitude, and leaders sought her wisdom in times of doubt. She had once been mocked, dismissed, and overlooked, but now she was loved in ways deeper than fame could ever offer. As her own days grew shorter, Clara often sat in the garden where she and Adrian had shared their deepest conversations. She would close her eyes and feel the breeze, imagining Adrian's presence still beside her. In those moments, she whispered softly, "It began as a bet, but it ended as the truest love," and she would smile, because she knew the story of their lives had already outlived them both. When Clara finally passed, the city held the largest funeral it had ever seen. People from every corner gathered, not to mourn alone, but to celebrate her life. The poor, the rich, the young, the old, all came to honor the woman who had turned cruelty into compassion, arrogance into humility, and a reckless bet into a lasting legacy. Beside her grave, carved into stone, were the words Adrian himself had once whispered. "She was my greatest fortune," and so the story ended. Not with laughter, not with scandal, but with a truth the world could no longer deny. That love, when chosen, when nurtured, when built with patience, could transform even the coldest pride into something eternal. Adrian and Clara's names lived on, not as a tale of mockery, but as a story of hope, a story that proved appearances fade. Wealth changes, but love, real love, leaves a legacy that never dies. Long after Adrian and Clara were gone, their story remained alive. It was not written only in books or carved in stone, but in the lives they had touched. Children who once read in Clara's libraries grew into leaders, teachers, and dreamers. Many of them carried her words in their hearts, words she had spoken with calm strength. Kindness builds more than walls. It builds people. The city that once mocked their union now celebrated it each year. On the anniversary of Clara's first library, people gathered to honor her memory. They lit candles, shared stories, and spoke of how one woman's quiet dignity had reshaped an entire community. The name Clara was no longer whispered with laughter. It was spoken with reverence, and Adrian's name stood beside hers, no longer tied to arrogance, but to redemption. Generations later, parents told their children the tale of the millionaire and the woman he married as a bet. They did not tell it as a story of shame, but as a lesson in transformation. They spoke of how arrogance can fall, and how love can rise in its place. They told children to look beyond appearances, to see strength where the world sees weakness, because Clara's life had proven that true worth is not in how someone looks, but in how they live. In schools, teachers used the story as an example of character. They reminded their students that wealth may build empires, but only humility builds legacies. They explained how Adrian's power would have crumbled without Clara's wisdom, and how Clara, once dismissed, had shown the world that greatness often comes in unexpected forms. The lesson became timeless, passed from classroom to classroom, from family to family. Even the mansion where they had lived became something new. No longer a palace of pride, it was turned into a community center, filled with books, art, and learning. The garden where Adrian and Clara once sat in silence was open to the public. Couples walked there hand in hand, children played among the flowers, and elders sat on benches to rest in peace. The home once filled with arrogance was now filled with love, laughter, and memory. But the most powerful legacy was not in buildings or wealth. It was in the change that people carried within themselves. Young men who once admired arrogance began to admire humility. Young women who once feared judgment learned to walk with Clara's quiet dignity. And families reminded each other that respect is not earned through pride, but through compassion. The story spread far beyond the city. Travelers carried it to other towns. Writers turned it into plays, and singers made it into songs everywhere it was told. People felt the same stirring in their hearts, because it was not just the story of one man and one woman. It was the story of what it means to be human, the story of falling, of failing, and of finding redemption through love in the end. The bet that began as a cruel joke became something eternal. It became proof that no mistake is too deep to be redeemed, no heart too proud to be softened. It showed that true strength is not in power or wealth, but in the ability to change, and most of all, it showed that love, when chosen, when nurtured, when lived every day, can turn even the darkest beginnings into the brightest endings. And so the final lesson remained, that a reckless bet could be forgiven, that arrogance could be broken, that pride could be tamed, because love, real love, does not care where the story begins. It only cares where it ends, and for Adrian and Clara, the end was not in death, but in the legacy of love they left behind. A legacy that whispered through the city, through the generations, through the hearts of all who heard it, that kindness is power, dignity is strength, and love is the greatest fortune of all.